Under the surface of country music's polished legacy, something fractured has long remained untouched. Allan Coe, now 85, sits at the edge of that fracture, not with nostalgia, but with fire. His story was never meant to end like this. It was supposed to fade out quietly, tucked behind awards, ceremonies, and well-behaved legends. But silence is not what Coe was built for. The tension has lingered for decades, heavy and unseen. He never stood on the Grand Ole Opry stage. No explanation. No inclusion. Just absence. Behind closed doors, names were left off lists, bookings vanished, and alliances quietly dissolved. There was no scandal printed in headlines. Only distance. He kept playing, kept writing, kept showing up, and the silence grew louder with each passing year. Until recently, when that silence broke itself. The voice didn't shake. The words didn't ask for anything. What emerged instead was a calm, raw unraveling. A set of stories that hadn't been shared. Not fully. Not like this. There were names. There were places. And there were reasons. Things only spoken about in low tones, far from Nashville's public image. The old man with the Outlaw songs had held onto more than memories. He had letters. Audio. Accounts others hoped would never surface. And now they had. There was no apology. No warning. Just a quiet release of history the industry had buried in plain sight. The fallout hadn't begun yet, but the chill had already set in. And for those who once wrote him off, the air suddenly felt colder. Allan Coe's path was never smooth. Born into instability and locked away before he was 10, his early years carved a hard edge into everything he touched. Behind bars, he learned to survive by sharpening both instinct and pen, channeling pain into music that was too raw for radio but too real to ignore. He claimed time on death row for killing in self-defense, a detail debated but never forgotten. That darkness clung to him, followed him, and defined his tone long before he arrived in Nashville. He didn't knock on doors. He parked a hearse outside the Ryman and waited for them to look away. And they did. Long hair. Tattoos. Songs with sharp corners. He was everything the Opry didn't want to see in daylight. When Tanya Tucker turned his words into a hit, he cracked through just enough to be tolerated, not accepted. Even then, Nashville's eyes stayed cold. Contracts were offered with conditions. Image cleanup. Compromises. He declined all of them. And when he refused to bend, the system began to close in around him, slow and deliberate. His albums spoke in tones the industry didn't know how to silence. Psychedelic fragments. Prison grit. Stories that bled. He didn't write for approval. He wrote like someone who'd already been discarded. His audience wasn't in boardrooms or banquets. It was in outlaw festivals, biker gatherings, and dark corners where truth didn't have to wear a smile. The industry labeled him dangerous, unmarketable, too volatile to trust. But the crowds kept coming. The people he sang for weren't looking for approval either. They saw something in him the suits couldn't manage. Honesty without permission. While Waylon and Willie played both rebel and icon, Coe stayed on the outside looking in, always unwelcome but never invisible. His music was too close to something uncomfortable. It was the version of country no one wanted to claim. So Nashville began erasing him in silence. No features, no awards, no mentions. The blacklist was invisible, but it worked. And nowhere was that silence louder than at the Grand Ole Opry. Despite decades of albums and relentless touring, Coe was never invited, never acknowledged, never embraced. Not once. The reasons offered were vague, always just out of reach. But whispers told another story, a private confrontation, a broken glass, a threat that sealed a door permanently. One executive, one moment, and an unspoken decree that still echoed through the years. Coe didn't forget, and the Opry didn't forgive. What followed was deeper than rejection. It was erasure. His name removed from programs. Event bookings rescinded without reason. Industry allies warned quietly. And when he uncovered alleged scandals, names, affairs, rigged charts, envelopes passed in private, those discoveries disappeared in break-ins and silence. He stayed quiet. For years. But the damage had already been done.
They didn't need to say it.
He was gone from their version of history. Still, he kept recording.
Kept performing.
Independent and uninvited. As radio stations turned their backs, bootlegs made their way through hands that didn't care about image. Underground fandom bloomed where airwaves went dark. Even as the industry turned colder, his crowds grew louder. He bore the isolation like a weight he'd grown used to carrying. But the silence took its toll. Recognition went elsewhere. Awards passed him by. And all the while, the Opry stood as a reminder, a monument to everything he wasn't allowed to be.
Until now.
At 85, he no longer blinked at consequences. In one interview, slow and unflinching, he named names. Shared letters. Played tapes. The things everyone knew, but no one would say were finally spoken out loud. And this time, there was no quieting it. The silence had already broken itself. The silence had stretched for decades, but once Coe began to speak, the cracks spread fast and deep. His voice was slow, but the weight behind it made each word feel sharp. He didn't rush. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The stories landed harder in that quiet. There were names. There were dates. Moments from the late 1970s, the kind that had lived as shadows. Rumors passed between locked rooms and hallway whispers. Coe didn't describe theories. He described incidents. One in particular, a closed-door confrontation with a powerful Opry executive, left the room shattered and cold. Glass on the floor. Words spoken that left no doubt. Coe would never set foot on that stage again. Not while that man was still breathing. No security. No mediation. Just a permanent divide marked by threats, and that was only the beginning. There were letters, too, folded and worn from age, sent by regretful insiders. Names blurred by guilt, but the details remained. Apologies written too late, never sent publicly, passed like smuggled artifacts from those who'd once watched in silence. The most jarring claims came with physical weight. Coe said he had recordings. Grainy audio from decades ago, captured in backrooms, at parties where reputations danced close to collapse. He described voices, unmistakable ones, laughing about who got chart placements and who got buried. A system built on payoffs and personal debts, guarded by fear and proximity. And then came the incident that changed everything. Evidence, he said, of a high-ranking Opry figure entangled in a scandal with a star whose fame outlasted her discretion. Affairs hidden. Career favors traded. Coe didn't just name them. He traced the web. Said he had documents once. Said they disappeared after a break-in that didn't feel random. He spoke of files he hid, copies he kept separate. Of nights he woke to find locks broken and nothing else missing but those papers. He described patterns, songs blacklisted, shows canceled without reason, venues suddenly unavailable. And the people around him? They vanished too. Former collaborators stopped answering. Management left. Invitations dried up, and not a word was ever said aloud. Just distance. Just disappearance. Behind all the noise and rebellion, Coe had watched. He'd listened as others accepted awards, were inducted, celebrated, while his name never passed a single lip on country's biggest stage. He saw the smiles at ceremonies, the standing ovations for those who once stood beside him, now turned silent. The industry had learned to act like he wasn't there. But it was never about being forgotten. It was about being removed. Coe described a culture of quiet fear, where speaking his name in a meeting brought discomfort, where artists were warned not to collaborate or show support. Some insiders confirmed it later, carefully, nervously. One called it an unspoken blacklist. Another said the threat wasn't losing opportunities, it was being marked the same way. They called it tradition, but behind the tradition was a wall too many were too afraid to touch. And now, as Coe stood in his truth, others found the courage to step forward. Former musicians, aging executives, a few journalists who'd heard the stories but were told to bury them. Each voice added weight. Each memory brought color to what was once rumor. But the response from the establishment came slow, calculated. The Grand Ole Opry didn't deny, didn't engage. They issued a brief statement. It said nothing directly. It referenced values, spoke vaguely of legacy. There was no mention of Coe, no effort to dispute the claims, no defense of those accused. Just a cold reassurance that the Opry remains committed to the traditions of country music. That phrase sat heavy. It was a silence crafted to appear neutral, but it spoke volumes. In the background, the machine kept turning, shows went on, tickets sold, spotlights shone. But something underneath had shifted. The old guard stayed quiet, but the corners began to crumble. Online, voices surged. Younger artists, digital creators, longtime fans, they filled the void mainstream media refused to touch. Videos went viral. Clips of Coe's interviews spread. Hashtags surged. Outside the Opry, quiet protests formed, not riots, but presence. No anger, just watchfulness. The kind that says, "We heard it. We're waiting." And the silence, once controlled, now stood uneasy and exposed. David Allan Coe never asked for vindication. He didn't plead for recognition or stage a campaign for redemption. He spoke once and left the silence to answer itself. In the weeks that followed, his voice did not fade. It echoed. Not through award shows or glossy magazine spreads, but through old recordings passed between hands and hushed conversations that suddenly became louder. The industry's response was calculated and hollow. Statements framed in tradition. Carefully measured language. Not a word to name him. Not a word to deny him. Just the same practiced silence that had held its shape for decades. But that silence didn't work the same way anymore. The cracks had widened. The air inside had shifted. Some who once stood in safe distance now stepped closer, their stories now aligning with his. They didn't speak with rage. They spoke with resignation. A quiet acknowledgement that something had always been wrong, and no one had ever said it out loud.
Until now.
And once it was said, there was no putting it back. The Grand Ole Opry remained untouched on the surface. The lights stayed on. The performances continued. But the ground beneath had lost its stillness. Demonstrations formed without shouting. People stood outside not with signs, but with presence. A quiet demand for acknowledgement. Nothing dramatic. Just enough to make others notice. Online, the silence ended first. Coe's music returned to playlists. His albums resurfaced on streaming charts. The numbers didn't come from nostalgia. They came from curiosity, rediscovery, and resonance. Younger listeners connected to the voice that refused to compromise. Digital creators broke down the allegations piece by piece, making the invisible visible. And in that resurgence, Coe became more than a cautionary tale. He became the proof that exclusion doesn't erase legacy. That survival sometimes leaves a louder mark than acceptance. Nashville's gatekeepers had long crafted a version of history without him. But now that version stood incomplete. What was once seen as rebellion now read as resistance. And resistance is harder to dismiss when it won't stay quiet. Coe himself didn't bask in the attention. There was no tour announcement, no press run, just him, at home, surrounded by guitars and old notebooks, still writing, still creating, still existing in defiance of silence. He no longer needed the Opry stage. The absence itself had become the statement. And that absence now carried more weight than inclusion ever could have. He wasn't trying to be let in. He was proving that even locked doors don't stop sound from reaching the other side. In choosing to speak at the very end, he unraveled a version of country music history that had rested too comfortably on curated memory. The reaction was not explosive. It was slow, uneasy, and still unfolding. But it forced the system to look at itself, even if only for a moment. And sometimes, one moment is all it takes for silence to stop working. The industry may never issue an apology. The Opry may never revise its books. But the truth has already moved into conversations, into recordings, into memory. It cannot be undone. David Allan Coe's final act wasn't loud. It wasn't polished. It was deliberate. It was cold. It was quiet. And it was complete. He didn't return to ask for space. He came to show that space had never truly been theirs to give. Every song he wrote, every stage he played outside the system, those weren't detours. They were the path, the blacklists, the cold shoulders, the locked doors. They didn't bury him. They built him. And by surviving them, he became more than they ever allowed him to be. The industry will move forward, still shining its lights, still holding its ceremonies. But the shadow of what was ignored now lingers in the corners. Coe didn't just tell his story. He forced country music to see its own. Not with anger, not with revenge, but with a truth that no longer needed permission. A legacy shaped by refusal. A life written in the margins. And a final chapter that couldn't be silenced.